The book of Judges makes it clear that there is a big problem in Israel. And as he concludes his book, he wants to identify what the problem is and show us how desperate it had become. He repeats himself as in the last few chapters of the book, saying there was no king in Israel, or more specifically, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then he goes on to show us just how wicked Israel had become by telling two tragic stories starting in chapter 17. And the first is a story about a man named Micah and his mother. Micah stole some money from his mom, and then he gives it back, and she was thankful, and so she blesses her son, and she thinks she should honor God by making an idol out of the gold for them to worship. And we see what's wrong here and just how foolish they become in chapter 17, verse 6, where the writer says, look, this is an example. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. A Levite comes along and meets Micah, and Micah might have thought this was proof that God was blessing their endeavor. And certainly a Levite was supposed to teach the people about God, and so you might have expected this Levite to rebuke Micah, but the Levite was swayed by the money, and he stays with Micah and becomes his priest. Later, the tribe of Dan is looking for a place to live. They send out some spies to Micah's house. They see the priest, they see the idol, they ask the priest to pray for them. The priest prays for them, they succeed, they like the land, they go back to Dan, they say they should take the land. The Danites come back to where Micah lives, they gather in front of his house, they decide they like his idols and they like his priests, and they take the idols and they ask the priest if he wanted to come with them, and he's happy to. And Micah finds out, and he goes out to rebuke them because he's so upset that they stole from him, but the Danites were too strong for him, and they send him back to his house. The Danites go on, they win a great victory, they take the land for themselves, and they set up a place to worship using the idol, and also Moses' descendant, this Levite, as their priest. Do you see the problems here? The Israelites might have looked like they had some concern for religion. I mean, Micah, the way his mom responded. They had Levites. Sometimes they even used God's name. They had places of worship, but they weren't submitting to God's word. And instead, what they were trying to do was combine Canaanite religion with what God had taught them. And that started with this individual Micah, and eventually it's a whole tribe that has turned to idolatry. In chapters 19 through 21, we see that Israel has basically become as bad, if not worse, than even Sodom. The story, 19 through 21, is very, very sad. We read here of people of Gibeah acting in a very corrupt way, one that parallels the sin of Sodom in Genesis 19. A Levite, again, has a concubine, horrible. The Levite and his concubine are staying at the house of an old man. When the men of the city find out, they come out and say to the old man, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out to you now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. Now, this passage, if you look down at chapter 19, it's full of contrast. So you have this father-in-law in verses 4 and 5, and you can notice how he treats the Levite. The father-in-law makes him stay. He shows so much hospitality to him. The people of Gibeah, though, how do they treat the Levite in verses 14 and 15? They would not show any hospitality to him. Who ends up showing hospitality to him? It's an old man from the country of Ephraim who's just sojourning in Gibeah. He's a stranger there as well. What does the Levite's servant tell him in verse 11? the Levite servant says, let's go to the city of the Jebusites, not even the Israelites, but the Jebusites. Let's go there to stay in it. But the man, why does he not want to stay in that foreign city? His master says to him, we'll not turn aside to the city of the foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. So he goes to Gibeah because the people of Israel, he assumes, know God and should show him hospitality. But they don't, and it's some old sojourner who takes him into his house. You can think about some of the characters in the story. We feel terrible for this concubine, and we should, but where does the story start in verse 2? What has she done? His concubine was unfaithful to him. She went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there for some 4 months. She had committed a kind of adultery. But what is the Levite like? What does the verse 25 say about his character? The men would not listen to him, so the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. So this Levite doesn't protect this woman at all, but instead allows her to be abused, even forces her out. Verse 28, look at how he responds when he finds out. Verse 27, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let us be going. But there was no answer. So he just grabs her, puts her on the donkey, and goes away to his home. What kind of man is this? And what is the point of all this terrible stuff? I mean, I don't even really like reading it. It's intended to show the sick wickedness of the people of Israel. Basically, every character in this story is wicked. And what's the problem according to 19 verse 1, chapter 19 verse 1? In those days when there was no king in Israel. Chapter 21 verse 25, which is the end of the whole story. In those days there was no king in Israel. In chapter 20 we come to a really sad scene. Because Israel failed to obey God and deal with the Canaanites, they've turned on themselves now. All of Israel now hears about what's happened to this concubine, and the Levite has sent out, he's actually chopped her up and sent out parts to the 12 tribes. And so they all gather together not to go to war against God's enemies, but against themselves. Ultimately, this is an act of judgment. Chapter 20, verse 35 tells us why this happened. The Lord defeated Benjamin. That was the tribe that was doing this to the Levite's concubine. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,000 men of Benjamin that day. All these were men who drew the sword. Finally, in chapter 1, we see some of the confusing consequences that came to Israel as a result of trying to do their own thing. They decided they wanted to wipe out Benjamin because of what they had done, so they took an oath not to give any of their daughters to the people who survived the war from Benjamin. But now, as they were looking back on the war, they realized this was too drastic a decision. They had all these men of Benjamin without wives, and this meant that tribe would be cut off from Israel. So where could they go to get wives when the other tribes had made this oath not to give any of their daughters to the children of Benjamin? So they decided to get wives for them from the camp of Jabesh Gilead, because no one from Jabesh Gilead was part of the battle, and that was like they were supporting Benjamin. So they went to judge Jabesh Gilead by killing their men, devoting them to destruction is how it puts it, which God had not commanded them to do, actually. And again, because they did not obey God's initial commands to take care of the Canaanites, they end up bringing God's judgment on themselves. This is the way that sin works. They then steal women from Jabesh Gilead to give to the men of Benjamin, but there weren't quite enough women for them. So they tell the men of Benjamin to steal women from the daughters of Shiloh at the feast of the Lord, which of course makes you ask all this, what is going on? I mean, what is going on in this crazy story? But what we're seeing is the desperate condition that Israel finds itself in. In spite of God's stunning grace and patience, they have basically come to a place of complete chaos, and they're in desperate need of godly leadership to bring them back to a right relationship with God. So Judges is essentially like a setup. Israel desperately needs a king. we need a king. And this is a big theme of the gospel. And as we work our way through Samuel and the book of Kings, and then finally the prophets, we'll see that David is a type of the king we need, but all of his descendants and David himself are not enough. They actually only end up bringing the people of Israel into exile. What we need is a king, but we don't just need any king. We need a certain kind of king. We need a king to come from the line of David, who is different from everyone else. And ultimately we know, as we read the prophets and then look to the Gospels, that we have hope because Jesus is that great Davidic king. And how desperately we need him.